Hey everybody, Cat RBHS here with a quick sort of off-the-cuff video. This is in a lot of ways a continuation of a conversation that began with the video on, on language, on names that I made a week or two ago. And I had some really good discussion on that. And I had some really fascinating conversation in the comments regarding names for directions in other languages. And this video is going to be a weird one. This is one of those, I just wanted to get up this morning and play Skyrim actually, but I just kept thinking about this exchange that was happening in my comments, and as I was taking a shower, I'd get it tied into this idea of Dryads and Tolkien. We'll get there. But, so here we are, and with regard to names, the purpose of that video was to talk about the naming conventions for the factions in 4th Age Total War, which is a mod. You must know what this is by now if you're watching this channel. What you're looking at, by the way, this is for the upcoming mod, Total War Wayne Riders, and I just thought it would be a nice backdrop. It's not really relevant, necessarily, so, you can just wander around your day without looking at the screen if you'd prefer to listen. So in that video, I was talking about the naming conventions, and some of the names were very simple. We have factions that are called the Chiefdom of Rune, the Chiefdom of North Rune, the Chiefdom of Far Harad, and these names just mean, if you translate them into English, they mean basically the Chiefdom of the East, the Chiefdom of the Northeast, the Chiefdom of the Far South, right? And these are not terribly exciting names, and so people have pointed out, those are not super evocative, and I agree. And then the follow-up thought to that is, what do we do instead? And then the follow-up thought to that is, maybe I disagree, right? Maybe I disagree that those names are boring, because those names, Rune and Harad, I think the argument can be made they mean a bit more than simply the word east or south in English. And I likened the word Rune in particular maybe to our English word orient, which is, again, sort of fallen out of favor by this point, but is a word that I think is fair to say is a lot more evocative, carries a lot of more connotations than the word just east. As a result of that video, I got some comments regarding other languages, Japan, and I can't remember the details of these comments or the originators, so apologies there, but also I don't want to out people necessarily. I like the idea that you can make comments and then I won't post a screenshot of you necessarily here to hold you to your every word. I wouldn't want that done to me necessarily, but there were some people who pointed out that Japan means, well, in English there's a common understanding, land of the rising sun, right? I guess it doesn't mean exactly that, but that's sort of an English version of it. And then someone else pointed out that in, I think, Slavic languages, the word for east essentially means something like rising or rise, and the word for west would mean, I believe, something like setting or fall. And I made the comment that, oh, that's really interesting. And then also in there was the word Norway, right? This is a place name which just means the North Road or the North Route. And so I was thinking, okay, so that's interesting. And I can't remember exactly what I said, but my observation there is that there feels like a difference to me between a directional word that means the direction itself and a directional word that has another layer to it, like another meaning, like rise. Like, that's a word to me that you have to parse, right? If the word for east is also the word for rise, then in that language you must use context clues or special forms of the word or whatever in order to determine which meaning you intend to evoke by saying east, right? If your word east literally means something else in the language, then that's got to, I don't know, it adds a bit of another layer. Now, in practice, that multiplicity of meanings is not going to give native speakers a lot of difficulty, of course, and it can seem absolutely everyday. And I think this was the point that there's a commenter who pointed out that no, that's just the literal meaning. The east, it just means rise in other languages. That's not poetic, right? I had said that it kind of sounded poetic or metaphorical. And he said no, that's just literal. That's what the word means, and it's not. And I've got to admit, I'm not sure exactly the sort of direction. We were kind of missing each other, I feel, in the comments, and I think I'm still sort of missing and maybe being missed as well in terms of what I'm trying to get across, so hence this video a little bit. But to the extent that I understand the point of like a country like Japan meaning, land of the rising sun, doesn't necessarily mean that Japanese people go around all day thinking of that image, right? The one that I always come back to is the English word chick, right? Which when I was in high school or whatever was a word that you could use to refer to like a girl, right? Look at those chicks over there, right? And of course that has another meaning in English, a baby bird, like a chick, right? Now, when you use the former meaning, there is no association with the latter meaning, right? Like there's no sense in which you are appreciating, oh wow, what a fitting word that is, right? It's how appropriate that the word chick for these girls also applies to baby birds. I guess you could argue that maybe originally there was some intended correspondence there, like the word chick possibly first arose. The meaning as a reference for girls probably first arose indeed as an intended association with the baby birds, right? It strikes me as a very Henrik Ibsen, the dollhouse kind of condescension. But regardless, I think that's entirely absent today, so the association is essentially gone. Similarly, these associations or the ways we express things sort of live on or die out or change, and they can be essentially empty. Like we can talk about sunrise and sunset. This is an old, well-known chestnut by now, but we can talk about those things while still sort of knowing on some cosmic level that that's not really what's happening, right? Like the sun is not literally setting beyond the lip of the earth. The earth is moving around, but that's just the best way for us to talk about it still, or it seems like it. So there are ways in which the language we use can be entirely transparent, right? And what I think I wanted to indicate was, at least for me, for someone who is not a native speaker of, Japanese or Slavic languages or, Norse, to see in those other languages the kind of etymology, those etymological layers, that is something that is very striking to me as a person who is interested in languages at an amateur level. And even though for native speakers that etymology may be entirely transparent and not meaningful, it is something that I think is interesting. One way that somehow I linked this back to Dryads in Tolkien was this line in The Two Towers. And you may remember the scene. Sam, Frodo, and Gollum are in Ithilien, and I believe it may be of herbs and stewed rabbit. I'm not quite sure, but it's before they've encountered the pool, right? Before they have encountered the Rangers. And in that scene, there's a long paragraph where Tolkien probably mentions about 50 species of trees and bushes and things. And he goes through it, and near the end of that paragraph, I think it's the last line in that particular paragraph, he says something like, Ithilien still retained its, and I remember these three words verbatim, it's disheveled Dryad loveliness. It's disheveled Dryad loveliness. Now, maybe that line stuck out for you, as it absolutely did for me on one of my readings years ago. And it stuck out for, a couple of reasons. One, it's a very evocative image, right? Disheveled Dryad loveliness. I think we can picture exactly what he's getting at there. Ithilien, at this point, is a place which is becoming wild, but it has a history of civilization beneath that thin veneer of re-creeping back wilderness. And we can see, as the characters do, the layers of that civilization, which is fallen and begun to be reclaimed by nature, not in a sinister way. In fact, in something of a gentle or a tactful way. Nature is coming back and covering some of the awfulness of the war that has passed through this region. You know, there's a ghastly scene, maybe in that same chapter, maybe a little bit later, where Sam comes upon a ring of slaughter, where there's just bones and ashes, and there are ferns sort of growing back around it and covering it, but it was not ancient, is the expression that's used of those bones and that relatively recent killing. And Sam just backs away, and he moves on down the line so that Gollum isn't going to root around through the remnants there. But the point is that nature in Ithilien is seen as drawing a veil, and Tolkien may even use that expression, drawing a veil over this atrocity, over the wounds, right, of the war between Gondor and Mordor. So disheveled, in the sense that this is no longer a place that is being kept up, right? It is kind of shabby, maybe, right? It's not being cared for anymore. It's not being cleaned up. But it is not like when you just roll out of bed in the morning and go to the office without taking a shower or doing your hair or anything. It's not like embarrassing that it's untidy. It is carelessly lovely, right? Disheveled dryad loveliness. So the loveliness is there to moderate disheveled, which is awesome. But then in the middle is the dryad, right? Dryad as an adjective, right? What kind of loveliness is it? Well, it's a dryad loveliness. I guess that would be an adverb. Is that correct? I think it would. Adverbs can modify adjectives, and loveliness. Well, loveliness is a noun. Okay, so dryad is an adjective. Regardless, dryad is not a word we often use to modify other words, and it is, of course, a noun. But what is it doing here? And this is the second reason that this phrase stands out so strongly. Dryad is, of course, Greek, right? We're in the world of southern Europe. We're in the world of the Mediterranean, the mythologies of the classical world. We're sort of in a world maybe which seems more familiar or more at home in some ways in the Silmarillion than in the late Third Age of Middle-earth, right? The Dryads are, of course, not something one expects to see in Middle-earth. Certainly at this point, if we can find a corollary, I guess the closest thing would be something like, is it Nimrodel, right? The elf maiden, right? Wandering around down by Dol Amroth. So Dryads are from a sort of a different area from which Tolkien is by now famous for drawing his mythology, let's say. Dryads are from Greece, of course. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Tolkien is well known for taking inspiration from Old English. Of course, he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, as it was then called, and he was at home among the northern mythologies, Old English, Old Norse, and Finnish. I think the Kalevala was probably a chief inspiration for Tom Bombadil, and for a lot of his characters, actually, in early drafts of the Silmarillion, it occurs to me. So this world of northern legend and heroes seems very, very familiar to those of us who were aware of some of those stories or grew up with them to some extent. Dryads, maybe a little less so. But here's the thing I'm going to push back against. Because there's a letter that Tolkien wrote, I believe, to a publisher. You can find this in some editions of the Silmarillion, actually, as sort of a frontispiece. This letter that Tolkien wrote as a summary of his Lord of the Rings, or of his legendary that he was attempting to throw together. And in this letter, again, describing this to someone who has not read the books, he refers to the Rohirrim as heroic, Homeric horsemen. I mean, well, okay, on the one hand, there's Tolkien again. He can't stop alliterating to save his own life, right? So that's clearly a Germanic impulse. On the other hand, what the hell is he doing? Homeric? That would seem extremely unusual. Homeric horsemen, there's hardly any cavalry in Homer, right? Maybe in the Iliad we see descriptions of people riding in to Troy to support King Priam, but a horseman is not something I think of when I think of the adjective Homeric. Heroic certainly fits the Rohirrim, and they are of course horsemen. But in some sense, Tolkien wanted to suggest that the Rohirrim are Homeric. We could get there. I don't want to devote the video to that, but I guess what I want to say is that there is a classic inspiration, or certainly Tolkien was aware of all of these other mythological wells, right? And he could draw from them when he wanted to. And maybe he didn't want to draw from the Homeric well for the Rohirrim, but he just said that in a letter because he thought it was the kind of thing that someone else might understand more readily than if he had sought to relate them to Vikings or Beowulf or something. Because at the time Tolkien was writing, Beowulf and Viking stuff was, I would say, not nearly as popular as it is now. People, 100 years ago would have been much more familiar, educated people would have been much more familiar with the Homeric stuff than with the old northern legends. And they would have held it in higher esteem, more to the point. So Tolkien would have been eager, I think, to find a connection there for his educated, target audience. And so he attempted to do that in a letter, right? Maybe that's all that means. But disheveled Dryad loveliness does stand out because that's something that's actually in the work. That's not Tolkien discussing something, discussing the work to somebody else. That's in the work. Now, granted, it's not something that is said by Sam or Frodo or Gollum, right? The disheveled Dryad loveliness is clearly in the voice of the narrator / author, right? Tolkien himself. He is describing what he's seeing here. That phrase, though, has, I was going to say, come under fire, right? Like I've been watching too much news lately. But that phrase has stood out to people, and it's not always in a positive way. There was a blog, I think it was, that I, at least I have the impression that I read this rather than this is something that I heard or watched on a video. But the author was saying that, describing that phrase, disheveled Dryad loveliness, that Tolkien should have murdered that darling. If that is a phrase that is unfamiliar to you, murder your darlings is something of a famous injunction or call to arms in writing. And I don't know who started it. I almost want to say Stephen King. Maybe he was just one of the people who I read who said it. But this idea of murdering your darlings is that you, as a writer, will come up with phrases or characters or plot twists or just ideas that you think are amazing. And you will go out of your way to make sure that they remain in the work. So, to the detriment of the work, right? If you were more objective, you would see that these darlings, that these things, these words, these phrases, these whatever, are actually doing harm in a way to the thing that you are trying to create. They are marring your vision, right? And so what you need to do as a responsible artist, as the person who is in control of your work, is to kill that thing, right? You may love it, but you need to put it away, put it aside, and get it out of there, right? If it's not contributing, if it's not moving the story forward, if it's not contributing to immersion, you need to murder your darlings. I think in general this is very good advice. This is, I think, pretty old advice. Doesn't this go back to Aristotle in some ways, right? This tyrannical insistence upon unity, right? Well, maybe they're all just nerds. I just want to suggest that maybe people are wrong about that sometimes. Murder your darlings. Tolkien could have, right? He could have gotten rid of disheveled dryad loveliness. And it may have stopped us from maybe squinting and looking up from the book for a second and thinking, wait, are there dryads in Middle-earth? I don't remember any dryads. Are they going to find a dryad? But I think mostly readers are fine, right? You get halfway through the second book in a trilogy and you find the word dryad. You're not going to shriek and point at it. You are going to stop. You are going to maybe, if you're paying attention, if you're sort of aware of the kind of world that Tolkien is building, that is going to stand out to you. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Here's the thing. So I teach writing, by which I mean I talk about it and I make students do it. And then sometimes I give them some feedback on the things that they write. But you're not always in a classroom, right? Everything is not always a scored assignment by some nerd English teacher. You can do stuff, right? The image I have in mind here, and this is a leap, so forgive me, is the gospel parable, and I can't remember the context for this, but the sowing of the seed, right? The point of that parable is be spendthrift with the seed. You don't know where it's going to land. Now, the sower does. I think the sower's God in the parable, right? But to the extent that we can participate in what Tolkien would call subcreation, we can be the sower too, right? So the sower is going along and sowing the seeds. Some of the seeds are going to land on fertile ground and grow. Great. Some of these seeds are going to land on a hard sort of stone walkway, and they're just not going to do anything. They're going to get pecked and eaten by birds. Not so great. Some of the seed is going to land in thorny kind of bushes, and they're going to get sort of choked out by the bushes. Also not good, right? The point is, the sower sows, and it goes where it's going to go. And sometimes you're going to get amazing fruit out of that. There is a sense that I think a lot of intelligent, introspective artist types see Tolkien as their avatar, right? He is the person you aspire to be. He is the intellectual. He is the one who is sort of in control of his world, the world building. But he was also a guy who took a lot of chances, and he threw a bunch of stuff from a bunch of different places, and he saw where the seed was going to land. And you can look at some of those experiments, I think, and think, well, that's kind of silly. There's no dryads in Middle-earth. Why has he got me thinking about classical mythology now? And I don't know. I kind of think you would be missing maybe the point of that. Lord of the Rings is a big book. Big books are going to have a lot of stuff in them, right? They're going to have lots of references. And there's lots of voices and lots of layers and lots of tones. And the fact that some of those tones are not going to match other tones is okay, I think. It can be okay. Look at how the beginning of the Fellowship is written versus the end of the Return of the King. Or not the end of the Return of the King, but the wrap-up of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the end of the Field of Carmallin, right? That part, before the party is heading back north, but after sort of the big climactic battle stuff. There's this really strange, archaic tone when Aragorn is returning to the city of Minas Tirith, right? Like he comes into the city for the first time, as himself. And there's this biblical tone being employed in the Return of the King. That kind of stuff really bothers critics. I remember Harold Bloom, a famous American literary critic, edited an anthology of essays about Lord of the Rings. It came out, I want to say, in the 80s. And he wrote like a page and a half of how crap it was. He just couldn't see why anyone loved the Lord of the Rings. He's like, he preferred the Hobbit. Now, I think he's got a bit of a point. Harold Bloom is not someone I like to just sneer at. Got a lot of respect for a lot of his takes, but Lord of the Rings, I think, maybe not his best one. He quotes specifically a scene from, I think it's the Houses of Healing, where it's a scene where Aragorn goes through the city healing healing people of their hurts and wounds. And Bloom quotes a paragraph from there and talks about what is up with this tone shift. You've got this biblical language here. You've got this hurt or wound. Are they not the same thing? Isn't a hurt just a wound, or a wound just a hurt? And he sort of does this takedown of the tone there. But again, I think he misses the point, I dare say, right? You can have tone shifts. You can have an impression that you are entering a different world, especially within a longer work like this. I mean, you can do whatever you want. Of course, Harold Bloom knows this. I think his rejoinder would be, well, yeah, but sometimes it sucks. I mean, he would say it in a much more intellectual way. But then we're just in subjective land, and I can say, no, you suck, right? So anyway, disheveled dryad loveliness. There are no dryads in Middle-earth. That's a bit of the author creeping in, or a bit of other stuff creeping in, or maybe a bit of you, the reader, creeping out for a second. Maybe you get your breath and you realize where you are, and then you plunge back into the story with Frodo and Sam and Gollum. This doesn't destroy the idea of Aristotelian, unity. I think it just goes to show that Tolkien really was doing something rather interesting, and the fact that I think he could get away with this sort of thing, this sort of mixing and mingling, is just another indication that maybe many of us are not ready to appreciate yet, right? Especially if we look at art, literature, and writing as needing to adhere to these certain ideas. So by all means, kill your darlings, if you feel the need. But sometimes those purple phrases can do something. Be spendthrift with a seed, I guess.